Welcome to today's Energy Central webcast entitled ScottMadden's Energy Industry Update. Still haven't found what I'm looking for. A few housekeeping notes we'd like to mention. We acknowledge that given the current higher demands on internet connection, where many are working and schooling from home, technical issues may be more pronounced. If for any reason we find the need to restart the event, we invite you to click your same link to rejoin us. And in such a case, we'll resend those links to you via email. If you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone number listed in the right-hand panel under your interface, under the audio section of your interface. And following the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. We encourage you and invite you to submit your questions at any time using that interface to get those questions over to our panel. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to the moderator of today's event, Kristen Lyons, Partner and Energy Practice Leader with ScottMadden. Kristen, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thank you, PJ, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As PJ said, I'm Kristen Lyons, and I lead ScottMadden's energy practice. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, ScottMadden is a general management consulting firm specializing in energy. Our practices include generation, transmission and distribution, the grid edge, energy markets, rates and regulation, and energy corporate services. We work across the electric and gas industries for a variety of organizations, utilities including public power, munis and co-ops, ISOs, RTOs, independent transmission and generation companies, and many others. As such, we have a front row seat to the dramatic changes happening in this industry today, which brings me to my webinar. Our topic today is still haven't found what I'm looking for. So we're seeing this theme across many parts of the electric industry today, and we're going to talk about three of those today. Our first topic will be energy storage. So we've seen lithium-ion batteries take off in terms of installations, but we've still got some headwinds to address, and we're going to hear about some of those. In addition, we're also seeing both the need for and an evolution of the storage technologies that could change the services storage provides. Our second topic is ESG. We've heard a lot in recent years about environmental, social, and governance concerns and reporting. Today, we're going to hear about the different frameworks that are emerging and what they might mean for utilities. And last but not least, we're going to talk about small modular reactors, or SMRs. These are nuclear plants that have the potential to become an important source of carbon-free electricity. However, we face challenges in moving them to commercial deployment, and today we're going to hear about where things stand. So with that, let's move to our first topic. Next slide, please. Like I said, we're going to talk about energy storage. Next slide, please. Josh Kimmich is going to lead this discussion. He's a director at ScottMadden and has been with the firm since 2014. He spent much of the last few years working in the areas of grid modernization, DER integration, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, and regulatory reform. Josh?
Thanks, Kristen. So next slide, please. As Kristen mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the energy storage space today, and also what we're seeing in the future. So first today, looking at energy storage in the US, we've seen rapid expansion over the past few years. For example, the projections for capacity added this year are to be almost quadruple the amount of capacity added in 2020. And there's a lot of reasons for this growth. First, as with the renewable industry as a whole, rapidly declining costs for utility scale lithium-ion batteries, which makes up the majority of the storage today. With those costs driving down, it makes it easier and easier for products to be worthwhile to develop, and we're continuing to see more of that. There's also been a number of supportive policies, probably first and foremost, the investment tax credit for storage when it's paired with a solar project. And what's more and more becoming the norm is that utility scale solar projects are paired with storage as almost the default rather than exception at this point. And that's really driven a lot of utility scale storage growth as solar has grown as well. There's also a number of state mandates across the country early adopters, California, Oregon, Maine, and many others, New York, are starting to put targets on the amount of utility or about amount of storage deployed in the state over a time horizon, 2030, 2035, whatever it may be. And those mandates are starting to drive growth, and just as importantly, we're starting to see regulatory action within states to meet those mandates, whether it's things like solicitation for storage projects by the utilities in New York, Maine looking at different rate structures to encourage storage. And so that's where really I believe the rubber meets the road, as these states start to put the mechanisms and compensation in place for storage to meet those mandates. And also, I won't speculate what may be in any reconciliation bill or future legislation. There's clearly general push at the federal level to support storage as well, and that could manifest itself at some point in a ITC for standalone storage, or other policies that just further support this growth. Finally, there's a lot of room to grow in terms of storage applications. When we look at the current use cases for storage, and keep in mind there can be more than one, or generally are more than one for any storage facility, the 59% of all storage out there right now is conducting frequency regulation, and 39% is acting as a ramping or spinning reserve. And a lot of this was early growth in PJM, which has a very active frequency regulation ancillary services market. But it shows that for the other applications that maybe we hear more about, load following, peak load reduction, peak shaving, things like that, there's still a lot of room to grow there. So that all being said, there are still some challenges that storage is facing today. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest concerns we hear about storage is constraints with supply chain. And again, looking at from the U.S. perspective, where there's limited domestic participation in upstream or midstream, in the upstream or midstream supply chain. So we're talking about mining or refining, all the way even to downstream and manufacturing. A lot of that takes place overseas, quite a bit in China, but plenty of other places as well. And another challenge when we talk about supply chain on the horizon is also the significant growth in electric vehicles that are competing for a lot of the same resources, and the amount of money and certainty from size of investments that goes into building electric vehicles. Electric energy storage for utilities and the electric system is going to start competing head to head, and depending on, put more pressure on the supply chain. Also, there's interconnection challenges, and there's a lot of discussion today, and a lot of RTOs, ISOs, and with utilities for the challenge of connecting utility scale renewables to the grid. And all those challenges that wind and solar face, storage does as well. And then they get even more complicated because of the nature and multiple applications that storage, use cases around storage. So those challenges persist. And finally, as we look ahead to now, most storage duration 2 to 4 hours, but as we look forward to needs for long duration storage, past those kind of hourly capabilities, lithium ion, the predominant technology today, is not well suited to scale up to those significantly longer time frames. And so those are some challenges that the market faces today. But as mentioned, we're starting to see more and more demand for long duration storage. And next slide, please. And there are some driving forces behind that. A few things that as the market becomes more and more saturated with shorter duration, there will be needs for some longer duration applications, especially as more and more renewables come onto the grid. And some things we're starting to see drive that potential growth in the future. First, there's a pretty diverse set of emerging technologies. So while there's a lot of different things out there and they're not all going to pan out and be winners, there's not one technology that is either going to succeed or fail. in this space. And most of the technologies don't rely on lithium ion. It either, so all those supply chain, or some of those supply chain challenges we just talked about don't necessarily apply, because either it may have a cheaper non-rare earth metal, or, we talk about long duration storage, and this can be, anything 10 hours to days, weeks, even seasonally. The technologies start to change too, from batteries with non-rare earth metals, maybe pumped hydro, maybe compressed air. So the supply chain challenges, though there may still be some, are certainly different from lithium ion. There's also just some efficiencies with some of these where, for example, energy and power may be co-located, and pumped hydro with the generator right there. Or the ability to scale up. Again, pumped hydro is a good example of this, where it's putting more water in the reservoir to scale up rather than adding additional batteries in a lithium ion scenario. And finally, just like short duration storage today, there are supportive policies for long duration storage as well. The best example is probably DOE's long duration storage shot, which is concerted federal policy to drive down the cost of long duration storage over the next decade. Also, just the increased demand for renewables, and as more wind and solar come onto the grid, the need to balance over a longer amount of time also contributes to the demand for long duration storage. But there are challenges as well. Next slide, please. So for especially long duration storage, there's not really one, or in generally a lack of a regulatory framework to compensate a lot of these systems. And that's in places where a capacity market may be non-existent, or if it is, the compensation for that capacity doesn't quite match what some of these new long duration technologies can provide. So there's certainly some regulatory development that needs to go hand in hand with these technologies to make them worthwhile to develop. Also, interconnection, just similar to short duration storage, some of these same challenges apply for long duration storage as well. Also, depending on the technology, it could be constraints with geography. Again, thinking like pumped hydro or compressed air or compressed gas. There's only so many places that a storage facility can even be built. And then just the general uncertainty with various technologies that are starting to be piloted today, and we're seeing more and more come online, but it's not clear, which technology is really going to win out, and the exact benefits provided by those. Next slide, please. And so when we think about the utilities approach to storage, both today and looking ahead, there are certainly a lot of opportunities, but they require careful planning in a deliberate and iterative approach. And that starts with thinking about the roadmap for energy storage that a particular utility may want. What is the utility looking to get out of storage? What benefits can it provide to the system at a high level? What policy goals is the utility trying to meet through the utilization of storage? And then that means assessing the market itself. And this can be very regionally dependent in a specific ISO or RTO, or the regulatory environment that any given utility is in is going to change the opportunities for storage for that utility. So understanding those market and policy differences is important, and also anticipating how they may change over time as the entire industry evolves, including regulation around storage. And then finally, identifying the specific opportunities for a utility or a service territory. And that's thinking about all those things you just mentioned, the regulatory environment, the utilities goals, but then also a specific need on the system and how it can be met with a specific technology, and what are the advantages or disadvantages, risks associated with all those things. And this is not kind of a static approach, but rather an iterative process as the market continues to evolve, regulation continues to evolve, and more technologies come online in conjunction with the system evolving itself with more wind, solar, and other renewables coming onto the grid. Next slide, please. So certainly, there's a lot of exciting things going on in storage today. There's rapid expansion as costs come down and policies support, building out solar, this year, next year, in the near future. Though there's still some challenges, especially around supply chain. At the same time, we're starting to see demand for long duration storage emerge, and there's certainly some exciting possibilities with that, but also some challenges, especially around how regulations and how some of these different applications could be compensated. But from a utilities approach, the key is to have a careful planning process, being deliberate, not just now, but in the future in planning for storage, and being prepared to evolve that approach as the industry and the system evolve around it. So again, certainly a lot of exciting things happening in storage, and it will remain a key to the grid as it transitions into a more, as we look at carbon reduction and a more dynamic grid where we have more intermittent generation, storage will play a key role in creating reliable or bringing reliable service to customers. And I think with that, Kristen, I will turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Josh. So our next topic is ESG reporting. And Theo Tran, who is a manager in our Atlanta office, is going to lead this discussion. Next slide, please. Her experience includes work in corporate sustainability, energy efficiency, and clean energy. She's also ScottMadden's sustainability lead and a member of the firm's ESG committee. Over to you, Theo.
Thanks, Kristen. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to discuss with you the latest trends in ESG, but before we dive in, let's take a step back and just align on what ESG is. And I will preface here, this is not the only time we're going to be discussing acronyms on this topic. Next slide, please. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance issues. And the three of these make up a framework that the business community uses to evaluate and also communicate corporate activities in these areas. Investors are also increasingly applying these non-financial factors as part of their analyses to identify material risks and also growth opportunities. So you might have heard the terms triple bottom line, green, or corporate responsibility thrown around in the past, but these terms tend to be pretty broad. So as the industry has matured, ESG has become the preferred term for capital markets. And historically, companies have focused pretty heavily on environmental issues like waste, emissions, or renewables, but as thinking around sustainability has evolved, stakeholders are also now looking at social factors. So things like employee training and development, and also diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're also looking at governance factors, things like data privacy and cybersecurity, and also business ethics and integrity. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that investors are increasingly applying ESG factors to their analyses. So let's take a quick look at recent activity in the ESG-driven investing. Let me take a look at the next slide, please. All right, so before we focus on this graph here, just let me paint a picture of investment trends globally. So as of 2020, the total assets under management worldwide was $98.4 trillion. And of that $98.4 trillion, 35.3 trillion were sustainable assets. So that's just over a third of all assets under management. Nearly half of the sustainable assets under management, about $17 trillion, was invested in the US, and then just a little bit more than $2.4 trillion was invested in Canada. So now that we have a sense of where the dollars are going, let's take a closer look at this chart here. And this lays out sustainable investment strategies. So as you can see, there's one strategy which guides most of the sustainable investing activity in the US and in Canada, and that's ESG integration right there at the bottom. ESG integration, this refers to systemic and explicit inclusion by investment managers of ESG factors, environmental, social, and governance. into their financial analyses. So as ESG factors are becoming more explicit considerations by investors, this focus has really spurred an increase in ESG reporting. However, at this point in time, ESG performance and reporting is really voluntary. So let's take a look at what frameworks are currently available to help drive some of this reporting. Take a look at the next slide, please. So in addition to ESG reporting being voluntary, there's also no current universal standard for reporting. And this has led to the development of various frameworks with differing intended audiences and scopes. So as you can see from the slide here, this is where the other acronyms come into play. And we could spend an entire webinar alone decoding these frameworks, but for our purposes, let's just think of target audiences generally as investors or stakeholders. So investor targeted reporting includes frameworks like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB. And another one you might have heard of is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, that's TCFD. And when we think about investors, they're particularly interested in understanding sustainability-related risks and also the opportunities and financial outcomes that are related to those. And so you might expect that they would be particularly interested in seeing any data that's associated with material ESG issues. Now, other reporting frameworks you might have heard of, like CDP or the Global Reporting Initiative, also known as GRI, target stakeholders as the main audience. And stakeholders may include groups like customers, consumers, regulators, employees, and each of these groups might be interested in specific ESG topics, or perhaps understanding how a company is acting more responsibly, delivering societal benefits, or limiting its environmental impact. And so of these frameworks that we've discussed, some of them provide sector-specific guidance. And for those of you listening on the webinar today who are from the utility industry, there's actually a voluntary utility-specific framework that has been developed by the Edison Electric Institute and also the American Gas Association that might be helpful to look into. Next slide, please. So most, if not all, of the reporting frameworks we discussed include guidance on reporting around emissions. And there's increased scrutiny in this area, which has forced companies to take an ecosystem approach to their ESG activities. And this is really increasing the importance of capturing both downstream and upstream activities beyond direct operations. So there's a lot to break down in this visual here, but the takeaway is that emissions can be divided into 3 scopes. Scope 1 includes direct emissions from sources either owned or controlled by the company. Think of things like on-site power generation. And in this example, Scope 1 emissions are demonstrated by the green items. Scope 2 emissions includes indirect emissions from the purchase of electricity, steam, heating and cooling, and that's indicated here by the purple item. And then lastly, as you can see from the gray boxes here, Scope 3 indicates all other indirect emissions that occur in a company's value chain. And Scope 3 emissions are typically the most complex to not only identify, but also calculate because they're not under a company's direct control. And you can see there's many different components of a value chain that could be included within the Scope 3 emissions. And although we know that carbon accounting can be pretty complex, companies might actually soon be required to report on all greenhouse gas emission scopes. Earlier this year, actually, the SEC chair asked staff to make recommendations around how companies might disclose their Scope 1, 2, and potentially Scope 3 emissions. And what we've also seen is that there's also other indicators from current events that suggest that reporting might be mandatory in the not too distant future. So let's take a look at those on the next slide here. So these other indicators include increasing support from regulatory and legislative bodies. The SEC earlier mentioned that it was going to enact draft regulation with mandatory climate disclosure rules by the end of 2021. And then in addition to increased interest in the US, there's actually been a lot of action around this in the past couple of weeks in the world in general. So world leaders have gathered at the G20 and also COP26 summits to discuss measures to combat global warming. And what we saw coming out of the G20 was that leaders agreed to end the financing of coal power plants overseas, although there weren't any new commitments on curbing the use of coal domestically. However, in a first for the G20, members did agree to take steps to reduce methane emissions, and more firm goals were actually placed around this commitment at COP26, with a pact to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And COP26 is still underway. It's scheduled to end tomorrow, and we'll continue to monitor any commitments that are coming out of that. All right, next slide, please. All right, so we've established that there's increasing interest around ESG performance from the investor community, also increasing interest from leaders both domestically and abroad. And we also have established that there's potential legislation in the future that might mandate ESG reporting. So there's still a little bit of a waiting game to see what regulatory bodies like the SEC will propose, but there are actions that companies can take now to prepare themselves. And these include data management. Companies are going to be expected to ensure that they have high quality, accurate ESG data that's suitable for investment decisions. So this means the data has to be timely, it has to be accurate, it has to be complete, and it has to be auditable. In other words, can you trust the data? There's also going to be increased scrutiny around ESG data as well. So companies have to ensure that all forms of reporting are harmonized. Oftentimes what we see is financial reporting and ESG reporting are handled by different groups within a company, and it's going to be imperative for these two groups or more groups to communicate with each other to ensure that the information across all reporting ticks and ties. And then also, as ESG performance becomes more scrutinized, it will be important for companies to ensure that they have a centralized governance and oversight body over ESG initiatives and issues. And then lastly, taking that ecosystem view is also going to be important to close gaps on data around metrics like upstream or downstream emissions. And not only will companies need to gather data from up and down their value chain, they'll find that they'll increasingly need to work with their supply chain and with their customers to reduce emissions. All right, we could take a look at the next slide, please. So what are the key takeaways here? First, that E in ESG remains important. As sustainability and ESG are gaining traction, it's garnering a lot more support, and we might have seen a bit more of a focus on S and the G factors this past year or so, but the fact remains that the emissions and the environmental aspect of things are still very important for companies to focus on, particularly around greenhouse gas emissions. We also see that there's a push for standardizing ESG as well. So as we talked about, ESG reporting is currently voluntary. There's multiple frameworks out there, but there is a push to get towards something that's a bit more standardized and with standard principles and disclosure rules as well. And then lastly, there's also support for initiatives. Right now, the current administration has signaled support for sustainability initiatives, and companies should continue to monitor any regulations that are coming out and be prepared to respond, do things like improving data management and establishing a centralized ESG governance body. So that's what we have for now on ESG. It's a continually developing industry. It's a certainly exciting time to keep an eye on these things, and we're excited to monitor and see what comes out of these summits and conferences that have been occurring recently. And with that, I will pass it back over to Kristen to introduce the next topic.
All right, thank you, Theo. So our last topic today is SMRs. Next slide, please. Morgan Shadig is going to lead that discussion. Morgan's a senior associate in our Atlanta office. She brings significant experience in the nuclear industry, having worked in a nuclear plant and before she came to ScottMadden and as a consultant to ScottMadden's nuclear clients. So with that, I'll turn it over to Morgan.
All right, thanks, Kristen. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about a little bit about small modular reactors, or SMRs. So first, just wanted to get into a little bit on what they are and how they differ from what we see at current nuclear power plants. We kind of see this as 5 main differences, and we'll start by breaking down a little bit of the name itself. So small, so what does that refer to? It's really referring to the generation size in terms of how much output. So what you see currently is reactors are producing about 1,000 megawatts on average, whereas an SMR is categorized as something as 300 megawatts or less, even down to 1 megawatt as a microreactor. So what about the modular piece? So that is really all about the construction. So with SMRs, the goal is to be factory built and have them brought to site by rail or by a truck and placed together on site. And of course, as we know, current nuclear is one of the big hurdles is getting over the upfront capital costs and long build times and just construction expense. So that's one of the things that SMRs really hope to do is lower that big barrier to construction and initial kind of costs. So how are they doing this? Really, well, it's all about the differences in design. So there's quite a few different SMRs being looked at design-wise and technology. You've got light water reactor, graphite cooled, molten salt cooled. So there's quite a few different things going on. We do see light water reactor SMRs a little bit further along since they're most similar to what we currently have. But overall, the important part is that the designs are just so heavily simplified. And what that really allows is, again, this modular type construction. So hopefully those lower construction costs. And the other thing is a benefit to safety. So that the next kind of point there, in terms of one of the big aspects of safety with SMRs that's different with big nuclear is the reduced emergency planning zone. So we're talking measuring of miles for big nuclear, and with SMRs you're going to measure in meters or yards. So that really allows for a lot more flexibility on where you can put a nuclear plant, because it's pretty strict right now when you have to look at that big emergency planning zone. And of course, with a lot of digitalization, you've got a lot of remote operation and a reduced security threat with SMRs. And the last thing that's really pretty different is the flexibility. So a lot of these SMRs are being designed to be able to match electricity output to demand, basically load follow. And that's a little different than what we see with current nuclear right now, which is almost all just kind of that base load generation source. So next slide, please. So this really leads into some of the potential opportunities for SMRs. So again, this generation flexibility, with SMRs, they can really act as kind of current nuclear does now and be able to service the base load, or they could serve as kind of this ramping load following generation source, almost like you see a gas peaker plant doing now. And what's great about this is that it's a carbon-free resource. And unlike, a wind or solar, it's not going to depend on if the sun is shining or, if it's a windy day. So, these could really help play an important role in meeting a lot of these carbon-free goals that we see set. One of the other opportunities that's pretty cool is slotting an SMR into a retired coal plant site. We see the ability to be able to use assets that are already there, so some existing infrastructure, but also bring back some of the local community benefits, so things like jobs and such that might have been lost with the retirement of a coal plant, being able to get some of that back with SMRs. Also, the ability to service smaller grids. So, we see, again, such a broad range of megawatts. You could also put these in series and have, a larger megawatt output if needed. But, some of these smaller grids or smaller areas that don't need that large electricity source, it could be a really good opportunity for SMRs. We talked a little bit about the micro reactors, mentioned them, and well, why might some place need a megawatt or something? But you've got a lot of these really remote locations, or something like a military base, or maybe a research facility that just needs a little bit of power but need it to be reliable. SMRs would be a really great opportunity for that as well. And the last item, product production. So we just heard Theo talk a lot about ESGs and how companies are really trying to focus on this. And this is really a potential for SMRs to do things other than just create electricity. You create other products such as district heat or maybe hydrogen, or you could do something like desalination or mine cryptocurrency, which is a pretty hot topic in the nuclear industry right now. And so, you know, with companies trying to maybe do these things, but wanting to keep their, you know, their carbon low and trying to be thinking about all these things, there's a potential opportunity for SMRs to really play a role in doing some of these. Next slide, please. So where are we seeing SMRs kind of gain traction or interest? Really all over. We're seeing the graphic at the bottom kind of shows a lot of the different models that are out there being that are in different stages of the licensing cycle, and you could see the range of countries. So really, these are being looked at kind of all over and are all in a little different stages, but as the theme is, it's not quite there yet. A couple, you know, ones to point out. So in the U.S., we're looking at a couple advanced reactors to be operational in about 7 years. And this is through actually a DOE program that was established and really looked at industry partnerships to get these going. And so that's something that we're going to see come up here in a second as well, in terms of the importance of really industry and government type partnerships to push these to the next stage. A couple other countries that have been longer interested in SMRs a bit. So Canada actually released an SMR roadmap back in December of 2018, and they've really been long interested in these as SMRs as part of their climate strategy. So they've got a lot of stakeholder support, and they're looking at late 2020s for their first commercial SMR. And then the UK is another one that they've been conducting feasibility studies for SMR since about 2014. And last year, they actually funded a program to look at developing a demonstration reactor in the early 2030s. So again, kind of lots of different things and stages, but we're really seeing late 2020s, early 2030s as some of these initial pilots for, you know, for SMRs being operational. One of the other interesting things about the UK is that as part of their funding, they're looking at developing the regulatory framework and supporting the supply chain. So they're looking at this early on as a way to, you know, to hopefully mitigate and to be able to get through this process. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about these two items. Probably the biggest hurdle right now that SMRs are working through is the regulatory aspect. So, you know, again, trying to get through this licensing phase, since it's all new technology, has been a hurdle in a process. And what's going on, some of the things that we're seeing, of course, is a lot of, you know, each kind of section or country has their own regulatory body. And what's going on is it's leading to you know, differences in not only licensing processes and such, but basically you're getting kind of a patchwork of approval in different areas. So it does hinder a little bit the ability to, you know, get a more like broader scale and, you know, to be able to commercialize these a little sooner. So some of the things that are going on in terms of some collaboration between, again, industry and government to try to move this forward. So there's a forum created by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and this is a worldwide forum to really, you know, collaborate, share experiences. One of the pieces is looking at some of the common safety issues that can challenge regulatory reviews. So, you know, if one country's gone through it, maybe they can help the next. Another thing that we are seeing, the Canadian nuclear body as well as the US. So the Canadian Nuclear Safety Committee, there we go, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission actually joined together to look at enhancing the technical reviews of these advanced reactors and technologies. So talking then about supply chain. So we heard Josh just a little bit ago mention some of the supply chain issues with energy storage, and really a lot of those concerns and those types of concerns are also going to be applicable to SMRs as they start to commercialize. So both government and developers are trying to look ahead at how they prepare their supply chain. A couple examples of what we see. So the forum mentioned above actually has a recommendation of regulators increasing their oversight of vendor supply chain. So especially for things that are like a long lead time item, for the regulatory process, the review process, to actually look at this and ensure that things are doing, quality checks, all that type of thing. The other thing that we're seeing is not only a point to focus on products and material type supply chain, but also workforce. So being sure that we can maintain this critical nuclear workforce in order to be able to operate these at a larger scale. We're seeing not only, Canada has said, that that's a main focus of theirs as well, the supply chain issue along with the workforce, and we're seeing developers as well talk about it. I know GE Hitachi Nuclear just a few months ago announced that they were creating 80 jobs in Ontario, engineering, project management type things to support their SMR that's in development. Next slide, please. So some of the key takeaways, again, that we talked about in order to really get SMRs to the next phase, a lot of new technologies, a lot of barriers that we're looking to overcome, and concerns. So we'll continue to monitor as we see those start to move forward. We do see a lot of variable applications. So, again, not just electricity, but producing other products, but really, the SMRs being able to slot in and be a carbon-free solution to a lot of the questions and maybe non-carbon-free resources that we've got now. Development is progressing in a bunch of different countries. Of course, we're seeing still some barriers to get through, like the regulatory and supply chain that will have to be, kind of figured out before we get to that next phase. But overall, I think that, we're progressing and we're seeing SMRs possibly come to fruition, and it'll be really interesting to see what the next few years have to bring. So that is it, and I will turn it back over to you, Kristen.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. And if my other panelists can join me on screen, we're going to spend a few minutes on Q&A. Great. Well, thank you all for your discussions today. So we did have a number of questions come in, and Josh, I'm going to give you the first one. So it came in on storage. Let's see. So do you think utilities will transition from a, quote, no regrets conservative approach to deploying storage to a more aggressive entrepreneurial approach? And if so, how many years will that take in, say, PJM, New York ISO, or New England? Thoughts there?
Sure. So I think maybe stepping back big picture, I'm not sure utilities will really transition to a aggressive entrepreneurial approach just in general. And that's not that utilities are not innovative, but the regulatory construct and the utility being a regulated monopoly is just not in the business of making big bets and really big bets with customers' money in a sense. So in terms of maybe more aggressive storage deployments from utilities, I don't think it's so much the entrepreneurial approach. It's what will the market or regulators or policy, or truly a combination of those things, drive the need for storage. And then it's on the utility to evolve and innovate and meet those needs in terms of either deploying storage itself or facilitating storage on the grid. And as far as the timing for that, I mean, I think it's going to vary based off a lot of different reasons and in different places, but would see that following the policy and market around utility scale renewables in, say, PJM or wherever, and really what's the need for storage in a given area, because I think that will drive whether it's the compensation or regulations around interconnection to make that easier to meet those needs. And as there's more solar and wind, really intermittent generation on the system, that need's going to increase just to balance supply and demand over time. Then we start looking at long duration over weeks or even seasonally. So I think those things, and that's a combination of it making sense from a dollars perspective as all of these things become cheaper, and from a policy perspective, if there are goals to reach net zero in a particular state or region, and the need for storage to fill that gap to make it possible.
So it's going to be driven by needs and market.
I believe so, and I won't say how many years, but it's probably a few. If you just look at the projections for wind and solar, those kind of, I think it's going to follow that.
Sounds like it. So Theo, we got a question about the time that people are going to be spending on ESG reporting. And I'll qualify this with, I think that's a good question, and it's going to depend on a number of things. What are your thoughts there?
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Kristen. It depends. So we've seen a variety of different team structures when it comes to assembling folks together to help with ESG reporting. And it does depend on what type of framework companies are trying to report against. So examples are, we've seen companies with just one person managing reporting to a whole team of 3 or 4 folks because of the complexity of the frameworks or the complexity of the data that needs to be pulled together. So if you're thinking of reporting against a framework like GRI, it is a bit more involved than, say, if a company was just looking to report out on carbon emissions. What we also would like to note too that folks should be thinking about is sometimes the data that is required for ESG reporting is already being collected. So things like safety records, or even if we want to think about diversity numbers, those might already be collected. They just might not be integrated or easily accessible to an ESG team there. So just some factors to consider. Data might already be out there. It might be on spreadsheets. It might be a bit more advanced than that. So it really just depends on the dynamics of the company that's looking to report. But it can get pretty involved just because of what ESG reporting requires.
So I think it's safe to say that if a company is good at data management and data governance, this is going to be an easier proposition for them. If they're not good at it, it's going to be harder and take more time.
That's exactly right. And a lot of it too is just cleaning up data as well, cleaning up past data, making sure that it syncs up with current data.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. So Morgan, we got a question about SMRs, and the question was, could SMRs play a role in heavy manufacturing like steel and cement? Thoughts there?
So I guess a couple things. I would think that, I'm not quite sure in terms of sizing for the application and how it would relate, but what I think that we're going to see a trend kind of with companies, again, looking for this kind of carbon-free production and such, that, we could see them looking at generation, trying to get generation at the source of manufacturing. So again, maybe having an SMR just to really power the facility. And I think that you could definitely see that start to happen with a lot of, many types of manufacturing.
Is it safe to say that SMRs can really be a substitute for most types of generation out there today? Whether that's for a microgrid to feed the larger grid, et cetera?
I might be a little biased, but I like to think so. It's, just with their flexibility, I think that you see lots of capabilities You know, they also have the ability to, of course, have multiple SMRs in series, so you can gain a higher megawatt if needed. They've just got so much flexibility, and there's so many different technologies as well that I think that they could really, you know, be one of the carbon-free answers, and yes, substitute for almost any generation source that's needed.
While I have you, a question came in about the security side. And the security is one of the areas where a nuclear plant requires a tremendous amount of staff to keep it safe, the traditional nuclear plants. How does that look different with an SMR?
So a couple things. First of all, we mentioned a lot of digitalization and like remote operations. So security staff will be a little bit less and really operations staff in general to run them. So we just see less staff on site and being able to do this off site and remotely. The other thing as well that's a little bit different is a lot of these SMRs are looking at being developed in their house kind of underground. And the way that they're done, it's an inherently safer design. And so that's what really helps reduce that, that threat of the security threat. And so I think that with those, we'll see a pretty small security force and such as compared to what you see with big nuclear today, whereas you have these really large sites, which, you know, again, because of these emergency planning zones and all, you could see this a lot smaller with SMRs.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. So let's see, back to Josh. Regarding battery deployment, do you see supply chain shortages as transient or transformational? Will the market have to adapt to a longer term supply chain constraint?
So I'll give the consultant answer that probably both. I think we're already seeing some adaptation in the sense that plans for storage manufacturing in the U.S., for example, anticipating this demand. And I mean, I think it's probably driven as much, if not more so, by electric vehicles than utility storage. But again, from a lithium-ion perspective, there's a lot of overlap. But the challenge when you start going upstream for mining and refining to a lesser extent is, from a lithium-ion perspective, there's some limitations on some of the key inputs there and where you can get them. China, not just China, but Chile, Democratic people, or DR Congo, places like that. So where you might see some changes there is when we talk about long duration storage and not being reliant on one technology or, you know, one mineral, and having more options, I think, are some ways to address that longer term need. And then there's always the short term challenges around geopolitical issues or just, you know, self-interest of a particular country with supply chain shortages. So I think it's both, that we're already seeing some changes.
Gotcha, makes sense. So Theo, here's one for you. Can you discuss how standards for ESG and carbon emissions reporting could be put in place in the US?
Sure, that's a great question. So I do want to preface with, right now, companies have to, well, public companies have to disclose risks that are material to investors. And so there is a section in SEC reporting right now, that's the management discussion and analysis section, where companies can report out on climate related risks. But again, that's up to the individual company at this point in time to identify those risks and disclose them in that part of the 10K, 10Q reporting. We did talk a little bit earlier about how the SEC recently publicized its intentions to draft regulation with mandatory climate disclosure rules by the end of 2021. We are getting a little bit close to the end of 2021 yet, and are still waiting to see updates on that front, but it is a space that's clearly rapidly evolving and would be good to keep an eye out on. It's coming down the road. So really the main message would be to keep an eye on regulations, but also start to prepare.
So we talked a minute ago about some of the challenges that companies writ large will have with ESG reporting. When you think about utilities, and I know you've worked a lot in a lot of utilities, what makes this particularly difficult for them? We talked about the state of data before. Other thoughts there?
Sure. Yeah, it does boil down to data. It's not exactly a utility specific challenge, but there are perhaps more challenges for utilities depending on just the type of environment in which they're operating. And so there are challenges with things like ensuring that data from the same year is collected in the same way across different sources of emissions. And so if we think of something as simple as a 2015 baseline year for greenhouse gas emissions reporting, that data might have been collected a little bit differently than it is currently in 2020. So ensuring that just even the operational boundaries of the data, how it's collected, and how it's been converted into greenhouse gas emissions equivalents, depending on the sources, have to tick and tie together. And so again, it's ensuring that there's data integrity, and that takes a lot of digging into different sources just to make sure that everything is comparing apples to apples, if you will.
Yeah, the baseline matters.
It really does. Mm-hmm.
All right, so Morgan, we haven't talked about cost yet. So do you think SMRs are actually going to be cost competitive? I mean, we've seen the new challenges with building big nuclear and cost overruns there. What are your thoughts on the same question for SMRs? Morgan, you're muted.
Yep. All right. So cost is, one of the, obviously, I think one of the main reasons that we don't see new current nuclear as we have today. And of course, there's no proven track record yet of SMRs and whether they will be less costly, but I think that there's good reason to believe that the simpler construction will really lead to a lesser cost. I know that they've done a couple studies looking at LCOE, or the levelized cost of energy. The last I looked, I think it was Lazard that puts out some LCOEs, and current nuclear is around like 200, I think, for actually building a new site. And they've done some studies on some of the new scale reactors that look to be approximately, I think it's $65 per megawatt hour. And they've also, there was another, with NuScale partnering with the Utah power system, I think it's UAMP. When they went ahead and reviewed their proposal, they're targeting about $55 to $58 a megawatt hour. So I think, although it's not proven yet, I think that there's good reason to believe that it will be more cost competitive than current. And of course, it'll also help if we see some policies that start to include nuclear in our, as a carbon-free generation source.
Yeah, I think the discussion about policy has to focus on how you manage the cost piece, because again, it's how many technologies that are out there today got their footing in the markets as they exist today. So thank you for that. Thank you to all of you for the time spent on this. So thank you to our audience. We appreciate you tuning in today. This webinar will be available on our website, ScottMadden.com, as is our energy industry update on which these materials were based. So again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, panelists. Fantastic presentation. We did put a link to that EIU report also for our audience, so you can have easy access to that. We hope you've enjoyed our discussion. As you log off, please take a moment to give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending. Thank you, panel, for coming, and we conclude today's presentation with that. Take care.